fine session, and it's Catriona Crowe. And this is not the first time I've introduced you. The first time I introduced Catriona was in 2010 at the Irish Conference of Irish Historians in Britain, where you kindly came to talk about clerical abuse. And this followed Catriona's essay on the Ferns Report, which appeared in the Dublin Review 2006, and which was an exercise in controlled indignation. The second time I introduced you was in 2016 at the Hospitable Bodies Symposium.
Oh, I've forgotten that.
Catriona talked about Roger Casement with a group of dancers who were putting Casement's career into dance form. This was in the British Library. So already you get the indication that we're dealing with not only an archivist and a historian, but also a cultural commentator and an activist. Catriona, as you will know, I think, was for more than 40 years at the Public Record Office, later the National Archives, and for more than 15 of them, I think, the head of special projects. We associate her with the Irish Census Online, the project that culminated in 2007 and put the 1901 census and the 1911 census online. She's the editor of Dublin 1911, which appeared in 2011. She's an editor of the Documents in Irish Foreign Policy series, which we might come back to in our conversation. But she has also been the president of the Women's History Association of Ireland, vice president and then honorary president of the Irish Labour History Society, chairperson of SAIL, the community project that provides support for women affected by addiction and poverty, co-founder of the Inner City Renewal Group, chairperson of the Irish Theatre Institute, and so on and so on. So I knew these things, but because I'm a historian, I thought I'd do a little bit of research anyway. And there were two things I found about you that I particularly liked. One of them came from Dermot Ferreter's talk about you when you were awarded your honorary doctorate. Dermot said of you, "She traverses many worlds and is true bohemian and an inspiring force of nature." And I thought, well, I've got to quote that. And the second one came from your interview with Tommy Tiernan. It wasn't the interview itself, it was the comments afterwards. And you must do this, you look through these things and you expect usually to find divisions of opinion. And there weren't any. There were 23 comments and they were all fantastically nice about you. But one of them, which I wrote down, was, "It was nice to listen to someone who wasn't fecking going on about themselves." And there's a lot of that in academia. Now,
Oh no.
now, so I'm an 18th century historian originally, and I grew up, therefore, or I learned my trade in the shadow of the destruction of the Public Record Office in the Four Courts in 1922. All the best work on the 18th century when I was a student was done by broadly left-wing historians on the basis of court records, because court records were the only way you could find out about ordinary people. And, one learned how to read these things against the grain, as we say. So we knew they were written by the dominant, but we knew that they also gave you an insight into the lives of people who were subordinated or oppressed or just poor. Now, you must have thought about this because you've been in that building, in that institution. So I wonder, the first thing I wanted to ask, it's about the destruction of records, how that shaped your experience, whether you worry about destruction today deliberate, accidental, unintentional, so on?
I do. I suppose when I came to work in the Public Record Office in the early 70s, there was this miasma of despair hovering over the building, which, everything had been blown up in 1922. It took quite some time to discover that really wasn't true. That in fact, the big 19th century archive, the Chief Secretary's Office papers, which is a fantastic archive, bits of 18th century stuff that you will know about, Ian, then. By the way, thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you for doing some research, and wasn't expecting any of that. I'm quite overwhelmed. But I remember a friend of mine who was a fellow archivist. 5 archivists started at the same time in the 1970s, which was the biggest increase in staff since 1922. Still wasn't enough. Composed a rubric to send to people who wrote in looking for things that had been destroyed. Dear Sir and Madam, I regret to inform you that the item you seek perished in the shocking conflagration of 1922, and there is no substitute available. We did that for years. Then we discovered actually lots of stuff was still there. The 1901 and 1911 census, which you referred to, which were by far the most popular records in the Public Record Office. The Chief Secretary's Office papers, the Office of Public Works, which everyone thinks is boring, but is very far from boring, which is really the history of the public infrastructure of the country. Some of that going way back into the middle of the 18th century. Valuation Office material, Department of Education stuff. Lots of material was still there and survived, but the miasma remained until we finally got the National Archives Act of 1986. And that changed everything. It didn't increase our staff, of course, because the powers that be in the Department of Finance, my mortal enemies, insisted that we could do 3 times the amount of work without any increase in resources. But everyone in this room is absolutely cognizant of these restraints that are imposed on us. But what it did for the first time was give us the power to compel government agencies to deposit their records after 30 years in the National Archives. And if they didn't, they could go to jail for 2 years or pay a significant fine. And after many years of begging and coaxing and cajoling and trying to manipulate people into not destroying their very valuable records, I could now march in and threaten them. And it was utterly delightful, I have to say, to be able to say to miscreant bureaucrats who thought that's just a load of old dirt in the corner. Well, no, it isn't. It's actually the records of people employed during the famine on piers and roads. Do you care for 2 minutes what that is? They actually destroyed those in the Abu Dhabi before the Act came. So suddenly we had power. But not just that. This deluge of records arrived into the record office, the new National Archives. Huge amounts of material that we knew existed, but we hadn't really taken in the huge quantity of stuff that was coming our way. And it was chaotic, but we managed to get everything onto shelves. We managed to start making this material available, and it led to a flowering of 20th century Irish history in particular, because all of these new sources were now available to historians that hadn't been there before. And we became very popular. Lots of people wanted to come in and sit in our reading room and do all of that. And it was a great day for Ireland, as they say. And God bless Gareth Fitzgerald, who was the person who started the bill when he was out of office and then managed to get it through. So we're very pleased with our legislation, and listening to what's happening in the North, the difficulties they're experiencing with a variety of different pieces of legislation that you have to observe all the time, and an act that is probably antiquated now, that it'd be marvellous to get new legislation for you out there, because it really streamlined things for us and made everything much easier.
Thank you. So, and if we go then a century later and think about the decade of centenaries,
Yeah.
Which you were very much involved in, what does that tell us about cooperation between archivists and historians?
Well, archivists and historians have interesting relationships. That if you watch a TV program on history, there'll be a historian, very often a man in a fabulous shirt, and the shirt will change, as he moves around the place doing things. He will sit down in an archives, and a person with white gloves, usually a woman, will lay before him a 14th century roll or a legal book from the 18th century, and then melt away into the dark. This drives archivists crazy. On the other hand, historians are driven crazy by archivists who have anal retention and say, you're not getting that. It's closed for conservation forever. You're not going to see it. So there are things on both sides, but largely Ireland being a small country where a lot of people know each other, relationships are very harmonious by and large, and there are lots of projects that we could discuss where there's been massive collaboration between archivists and historians. But the decade of centenaries presented certain opportunities as well as challenges. We were going to be looking back at a very turbulent and violent decade in our history. We'd recently resuscitated World War One, which of course had become subject to serious amnesia for a long time. John Horne, who I'm sure you know very well, wrote a book called Our War, which was published by the Royal Irish Academy, I think about 2010, in advance of the centenaries, and Holy War broke out on the radio. It's not our war. You can imagine, you know what these discussions are like. Then there would be the 1916 Rising, the War of Independence, and the Civil War coming hot on each other's heels. So myself and a couple of other people thought that this was a great opportunity to get the two huge collections of records that had been closed up for a very long time, the Bureau of Military History, which is the oral history of that period made in the 1940s and 50s, and the military service pensions files, which begin in 1923 and continue into the 1950s, which are people looking for pensions for active service during these different conflicts. The Bureau of Military History was for years locked up in a strong room in the Department of the Taoiseach in Marion Street with two keys to the door. One belonged to the Department of the Taoiseach, the other to the Department of Defence. One couldn't open it without the other. Within lay these shining boxes of perfectly archived material in beautiful nick, but not available to anybody. So after lobbying, and this is where the historians come in, when you have people like Dermot Ferreter and Ewan O'Halpin and latterly Charles Townsend, who are willing to lobby on your behalf to get these records released, they are. Peter Young, who was the archivist in the military archives at that time, and I got a phone call one September morning in 1999, and we were summoned to the Department of Taoiseach and told the records are released. You got your wish. Hallelujah. So we came out of there at 12 o'clock in the day, and we have to have a drink. So we went to the Stephen's Green Hotel and had a whiskey each and toasted each other. And I saw him off at the corner. He blew me a kiss, and I never saw him again. He died 2 days later from a massive heart attack. And he was a major hero of Irish archives, an access junkie like me who wants stuff to be open and available as much as possible. But from there, we managed to get the material finally out and available to the public by 2003 and digitized by 2010. We got the first release of the military service pensions records, which in many ways are far more sensitive and delicate, available by 2014 in advance of the centenary of 1916. And what this did was create wonderful resources for everybody to look at. Everyone in the country was really interested in 1916, much more so in the War of Independence, because it was a much broader conflict. And of course, in the Civil War, although slightly frightened by it, now they were able to have access to these first-class primary sources with wonderful catalogues, particularly the military service pensions files. And my friend Cecilia Gordon is here today, and she is to be congratulated on the work that she's done and overseen that project for many years now. And it created complicated narrative, which is what people like me would always have wanted for that decade, that people started to question myths and legends that had been handed down through families for decades, started to get interested in what their neighbours were up to as well during the period, and started to look at their localities as broader entities. And you have to remember that when Jean Kerrigan, one of our most famous journalists, was at school in the 1960s, Carlton Younger appeared on the Late Late Show on the big TV program here and started talking about the Civil War. He'd just written a book about the Civil War. And Jean turned to his aunt and said, "What Civil War?" He had never heard of it. This was a man in his 20s who lived, alive till then. Nobody had heard of it unless it came down quietly in that subterranean way through family history. So opening all that up and now having fantastic, and one of the great things about Ireland is we buy history books, probably more per capita than most Western countries. People still want to know about their own history, and there were several extraordinary history books which were there in time for people to read them before the anniversaries came round. So the historians really stepped in when the archives were made available and did their job, including our mutual friend Roy Foster, who wrote Vivid Faces in time to be available in 2015. So everyone could look at this brand new study of intergenerational conflict for the people who fought in 1916, or some of them, not all. Um, and, we could have had a much worse time with the decade of centenaries. It was kept out of the hands of any kind of extremism and put sharply into the focus of, for the first time in a way, we started to look at bereavement, death, injury, trauma, which now is a subject we've just been discussing it this afternoon in the workshop I was at. That, Joe Duffy writes a book about the children of 1916. No one had ever thought of the 40 children who were killed in 1916 before, what that did to their families, what the consequences were thereafter. People started to look at the extraordinary casualty rate for the First World War, which was about 40,000. It's disputed, I know, but more than that, 160,000 people injured. And it became a very interesting moment where instead of the heroism and the glory and all the rest of it, we were looking at the consequences of violent conflict, what it does to societies, to human beings, to families, to loved ones. And for me, that was a huge step forward and something that was really important. A very interesting moment in all of this was I've been working with a theatre company called Anu, who are Ireland's best site-specific theatre company for many years now, usually on historical events like the 1913 lockout. They did a wonderful play on the one PAS brigade from Dublin that joined up during the First World War, young rugby players who all joined up at the same time, which again brought the First World War back into focus for people. Lots of other stuff. But they did a remarkable thing in 1996. As part of that year's anniversaries, they decided to do a piece on the Manchester bombing of 1996, okay, where no one was killed, but about 220 people were seriously injured. An IRA bomb blew up the centre of Manchester. I was involved in it. One of the first things they did on the first night was to gather a round table of people who had been there when the bomb went off. Local councillors, first responders, people who had come to help out. I think one victim agreed to take part. And I was told at very short notice I had to chair this meeting, which I can tell you was nerve-wracking. But what was astonishing was everyone said, we've never talked about it. No one ever gave us permission before to have a discussion about this. People just buried it and got on with it. And it was disregarded as a major calamity because nobody was killed. And that brought home a lot of stuff to me as well about the sort of hierarchy of victimhood that you get in violent conflict and how we're very good on the dying for Ireland bit, but not the living in Ireland after the bombing has taken place and you've lost your legs or your eyes. So I suppose I'm kind of pleased that that country has pivoted towards looking at these issues more than some of the things that were going on in 1966 when I was at the 50th anniversary celebrations in Croke Park.
I'm sure there are people here in the audience who want to ask questions. Can I just ask you one more?
Of course.
It's about culture wars, and the politicization of everything, which, I mean, I know it was political already, but it's been intensely politicized now. And when you discover that Trump has fired the director of the National Archives in the States, or appointed himself the director of the Kennedy Center, when you think about some of the sort of more mild attempts by recent British governments to interfere in the organisation of cultural institutions like the British Museum, scholarly bodies like the British Academy. I wonder what you think about all of this and how worried it makes you.
Well, I'm outraged, sir, of course. Anything Mr. Trump does is insane, bad, and wrong. And the fact that 75 million people in America voted for him is a conundrum that will take a long time to work out. But he's like a bull at a china shop, charging around the place, causing havoc everywhere he goes. And now he has a fellow bull in Elon Musk, who's probably worse than him in some respects. They're causing chaos. It won't take long for that chaos to become clear. But before that, we might be in World War III, the way things are going. It's just like Trump is much bigger than the culture wars. He's actually a clear and present danger to human existence. Um, my Not my favorite, but I suppose the most horrible of all the people of Britain involved in the so-called culture wars was Michael Gove with his attempt to change the curriculum. And that notion of ye olde England to be brought back again and stop all this nonsense about people who came on boats with black skin. And let's stop talking about that and be very proud of the fact that we had an empire and what a great thing it was. The point is, it never works and it can't work. We were chatting last night about the Kenyan archives that emerged because very brave people took a case to court. Can you remember the name of the wonderful lawyer who took that case? No, I don't. Maybe somebody can, but that was an extraordinary moment. And suddenly it was revealed that there was an astonishing archive of material relating to British misgovernment in Kenya, particularly around the time of the Mau Mau Rebellion. And these very brave people got miserable settlements, but they were proved to be absolutely correct in everything they had to say. So sometimes the institutions hold up and sometimes they don't. What I'm more worried about these days is distraction and lack of concentration that comes from the ubiquitous social media and the incapacity. I mean, there's nothing I like better than a 12,000 word piece of history or journalism or something that you can sit back and enjoy for a good half an hour. But that seems to be hard going for a lot of younger people now. I mean, I've got a friend who works in a university and teaches English. And she was asked by one of her students once, do I really have to read all of Pride and Prejudice? So her thing now on her door is, yes, the whole book. So if somebody comes to visit her, they cannot ask that question, they must read the whole book. But now it's all about what they call articles and excerpts. And like you teach in university, although Oxford can't have succumbed to this, has it?
No, of course.
See, there you go. Some standards are still flying high. But it's difficult. It's not just that, it's the flooding of the zone, to quote Mr. Stephen Bannon, that great modern strategist, with nonsense, with opinion, the abandonment of a belief in facts, which is very bad for history. And as we know, the humanities are under attack all over the place. This is something we all have to be really careful about. And that affects archives and historians and anybody engaged in the sort of endeavours that we're trying to do. Because after all, everyone in this room is engaged in an evidence-based activity. You want to give people the opportunity to be able to access evidence-based material. And one thing we all have to remember, and it came up actually this morning when we were looking at the gaps in the archive for Northern Ireland, is that the official record, which we cherish and adore, of course, and especially in the National Archives, is not the only record. And it is definitely not unbiased. I mean, we have several eminent diplomats here today, and it's a joy to see them here. They would not claim to not have a point of view on the various things that they've been writing about over their years of service to the state, for which we're very grateful. So that we need to look at other kinds of evidence that can be got, particularly oral history, which is starting to develop here as a skill that's where people are properly trained and trained to deal with the evidence they get and to question it, and also to manage trauma if that is the subject of what they're looking at. So the culture wars are scary and they will continue, but I think they're on a level other than the kinds of things we were experiencing during the Tory reign in Britain. I think it's got worse and not better. And until we actually clean up the digital act, things won't get better.
Okay. Just one more thing. There's actually quite a big thing.
Okay.
So I mentioned at the beginning that Catriona's written about the Ferns report, the mother and baby homes, and so on. We've spent today talking about sensitivity and often trauma in the north. And south of the border, there are comparisons, perhaps, with dealing with that particular past.
Absolutely. And in fact, I've been involved in all this for a very long time, since I found a bunch of files dealing with children who were adopted in the US in 1996, which is a long story, but it woke me up to the fact that there were people all over this country and abroad who had been affected by the carceral institutions, and particularly forced adoption that emerged from some of them over years from 1922 on. There are attempts now to try and right the balance. That there was finally a law passed 3 years ago to give survivors, or affected people as they prefer to be called, access to their own identity information. So they can get that now without it being redacted or without being told it's not your right. The fact that anybody in this day and age until 3 years ago would have to, could be told by the state, you have no right to your own identity, is just terrifying. Now they can. Also, we have learned a lot from our brethren in the north and sister in the north. Wesley, who spoke so wonderfully earlier, and his colleague Joy Carey came down to a conference that I ran in the Royal Irish Academy last June about archives and human rights. And what we were looking at was the issue of the records of religious orders which ran these institutions for so many years. Those records are regarded as private records which belong to them and that they do not have to give to anyone. The first step taken in the north to deal with this by the Truth Recovery Panel, Truth Recovery Independent Panel, I must say it properly, was to get the Preservation of Records Act passed, which means that if anyone destroys, damages, exports, or interferes with these records, they're subject to serious penalty. We just copied them. The North are ahead of us on this issue by a country mile. And it's fantastic to be able to get the help and assistance that we got from Wesley and from Joy, who are available readily to help us out when we need to know what's going on. So the Preservation of Records Act had a chilling effect in the North and actually led to people handing over records that they might not otherwise have done. We're hoping it'll have the same effect in the South, and that the National Archives will do what it's meant to do now under that act, which is to write to all the religious orders and ask them to tell the archives what they have with fairly detailed descriptions, and then things can move on from there. But we're a long way from open disclosure and from absolute decency to the people who have suffered for so long, many of whom are dying out now, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, we've got a bit of time left. If you're happy to take a few questions
Sure.
from the floor.
I have to put everyone to code.
Over to you, please.
See, I have to put everyone to code. I think everyone is exhausted after a long day.
I know there are questions out there. It's just
Okay,
Adrian.
Breaking silence. Kind of related, but it's about more against the arts infrastructure. So we're about major controversy around the arts and launch. It will run and run from kind of similar to RTE. And it'll be very politicized, and there'll be lots of rocks and looked after, etc. So are you anyway worried that where that might go in terms of that, at the end of the day, might do a service to the art sector and artists generally?
Yeah, I'm really worried about it. I mean, This is the RT scandal recycled. We're going to be watching the Public Accounts Committee, which has its fair share of idiotic TDs on it who want to grandstand for 15 minutes and get their face on the telly and don't really think or examine the issues that are there to be explored. Maureen Kennelly has been a terrific director of the Arts Council. She's a friend of mine, so I'm biased, obviously. Notoriously, IT projects go wrong. There's all sorts of reasons for that. I was very lucky when I was running the census project because I had a guru in the Department of Finance who I stole to advise me on everything. And he was in charge of the whole thing. He designed the architecture of the website. He interviewed the people who were going to look after it, and it made a huge difference. Not everyone has that. And in fact, one of the things we could benefit from in Ireland is to have that piece of the Department of Finance, whose job it is to look at IT and all that goes with it, available to state agencies who want to do what Maureen tried to do and ran into trouble with. It doesn't matter how small it might appear to some of us. It's annoying to people. Artists are irritated because they feel that the Arts Council demanded high governance standards from them when they were applying for grants and so forth. The general public was capable of all kinds of outrage that we will no doubt see on the pages of the dreadful X and various other places. And it'll drag on forever. But the immediate consequences will be that Maureen's contract probably won't be renewed in April, as it should be, and that funding will come to a dead halt. That whatever they've got now, they might be left with, but they might not. So it's a disaster for the arts, which has been underfunded so radically for years here, and was finally catching up and finally getting to a place where the demand could be met by funding from the council. So no, I can't see any good side to this, and I can't see any way out of it.
Anyone else? Yeah, Susie.
First of all, hopefully fun question. If you could wave a magic wand and have one set of papers or collection digitized, like in style of the military pensions collection, instantly, is there one that jumps out to you?
That's a terrible question.
I know.
How can you ask me that? Well, until it was done, it would have been the books of survey and distribution, which are the 17th century record of land changes. That huge, extraordinary century when 75% of the country changed hands from Catholic to Protestant. They're amazing records.
What about the Chief Secretary's office?
Well, they are being done. Well, at least they're being catalogued, but not digitized. Yeah, Chief Secretary's office is my heart's blood. I mean, I sat with it for years in the State Paper Office in Dublin Castle. The State Paper Office was in the medieval tower here, just around the corner. It's not a good idea to put special archives into a thing the shape of a chimney, because if a fire starts, like, zoom. Luckily, it didn't. And I had a wonderful time there. In the 1970s, I was exiled from the forecourts where I was originally employed for getting involved in the union and causing trouble. Anthony Cochrane will appreciate how important that is in every workplace. But one of the lovely things about the State Paper Office was that it was a tiny table. It held about 8 spaces for people to sit at. And it was exclusively historians who came in. So I got all the historians. I had a wonderful time chatting and talking to all these marvellous people. And people kept falling in love across the table, which was so romantic and gorgeous. I'm sure there were many marriages that emerged out of the State Paper Office. But it was also incredibly claustrophobic and difficult and all the rest of it. So yeah, the Chief Secretary's Office papers, Mary, thank you for reminding me. This is the best 19th century archive relating to Ireland anywhere in the world. And it is due to lazy bureaucrats in Dublin Castle, right here, that it didn't get transferred to the National Archives or to the Public Record Office in time to be burned in 1922. It stayed where it was. So let's hear it for the idle bureaucrat. He reads, comes in at 11 in the morning, reads the newspaper and goes home at 4. These are the people who may save us from the worst parts of ourselves. So yeah, it would be that. What a lovely question. Maybe we will. I mean, it's being catalogued. At least that project started, and it's a very, very good catalogue. I oversaw the beginning of that project, and it was a joy to be doing it. But yeah, if we could ever digitize all of the Chief Secretary's office papers, I'd be a very happy girl.
Two people once fell in love in my troubles special subject at King's College London, who Eleanor knows. Still together after many years. And I must ask them sometime which particular week it was.
Better. We need to find out.
Well, it was the Anglo-Irish Agreement, or
You may be able to set up as a marriage counselor.
well, you make me disappointed now that there's only one couple. I was thinking about the rebellion papers.
Yes.
That's 1798 rebellion. The Registry of Deeds is an incredibly boring but very
Is being digitized.
Yeah, and so that was set up by the Protestant ruling elite in the 18th century, which was very anxious about the title deeds to land for obvious reasons. But it's now used to look at Irish investment in British imperialism, to look at the role of women in landed estate ownership and management, and so
It's a fantastic collection of stuff. Unfortunately, I think, now Mary may know better than I, but as far as I know, they want to charge for access to the digitized records. Like one of the principles we've had at the National Archives has been free to access. And do not be looking for money, since we blew up our own archives in 1922. This is the least we can do to Irish citizens and to the Irish diaspora, give them this material. Bureau of Military History is free to access. Military Service Pensions files free, census records, and a whole batch of other things on our own website.
2026.
That's which is coming up shortly. So that'll be free. And it's a really important principle. So I advised the Registry of Deeds many years ago about this and said, do it and make it free to access. You can afford it. It's cool. Well, I think they're going to break the rule, and well, I hope not. Yeah, okay, let me keep me posted. But yeah, that would be fab. And the other thing I would love to see at some stage would be Seamus Heaney's disparate archive united digitally, because there's fantastic stuff in Queen's, there's stuff in the New York Public Library, there's stuff in Emory University, who are the people who grab up all the Irish literary stuff, and there's still a very good collection in our own National Library. So if they could all be brought together digitally, I think you'd have an amazing thing. It'd be fun.
Is there a last question? But Roddy.
It's not an amazing question. About 10, 15 years ago, when social media really started to emerge as a real force in our lives, a lot of journalists began to question the authenticity of journalism, because they said now everyone is a journalist, everyone can publish their own stories. To a certain extent, that's murdered by historians. So they're the authentic professional historian. There are lots of people out there who put themselves forward as the source of historical fact. For want of a better term. That's coupled with the increased potency of artificial intelligence. How do we authenticate archives and historiography? What are best safeguards?
Look for a footnote. Seriously. I mean, that's a dead giveaway. If somebody says something, the question we should always ask all the time is, how do you know that? Where did you find that out? I ask it at my local bar very regularly when somebody makes an outrageous statement, and I say, how do you know that? I read it on the internet. Yeah, where on the internet exactly? I don't know, it's just on the internet. Now that's daft, crazy, sloppy thinking. And we've got to challenge that wherever we see it. And certainly don't believe anything that doesn't give you evidence for the assertions that are being made. And it's one of the reasons I'm opposed to privileged access to records. That rule 101 of historiography is that you should be able to test the assertions of a historian by looking at the records that person looked at to see if the way they have interpreted it is correct. Any decent historian will tell you that. If you can't do that, you're in trouble. But if somebody can't even tell you how they know that the Twin Towers was an inside job, for example, which was widespread after 9/11, you have to say, I'm sorry, you've drunk the Kool-Aid. You need to go and get help. But there's far too much of that around now, and I'm confident that it will become sexy and cool again one of these days to be the person who knows where the facts came from. And we'll all thrive. There'll be a huge demand.
Okay. Before I thank you, it says here summing up, and there are a few things I want to say about the day in general. I suppose my involvement in Quill came out of a fixation with the Joint Declaration or the Downing Street Declaration. I'm not quite sure how it began. But I became quite obsessed with tracing the origins of this document, which was very important because it solved what Sean O'Higgins and others called the theological dimension of the conflict in the North, how to reconcile self-determination and consent. And when that was got out of the way, people could move on to the practical matters. But in order to study it, I had to go to Armagh and talk to Roddy about what was in Cardinal O'Fee's papers, because Father Alec Reid, one of the originators of that document and of the peace process, had written to Cardinal O'Fee, providing accounts of what became Hume Adams. I looked at both the National Archives. I went to UCD, where Kate very kindly helped me with Dermot Nally's papers. I've been to Dundalk, and I dream about the day when Alec Reid's papers will be made publicly available, because many of the things that mystify me most, the answers to those puzzles, I think, are in there. And what is fantastic for me about Quill is the idea that somebody might be able to bring all of those different collections of papers together and see them on the screen free and get insofar as it's possible a 360-degree view of what was going on. And that's just one particular strand of the peace process. There are many others that I hope will be it will be possible to understand better in the same way. I was really struck by something that Kate Manning said in the last session, in answer to a question. This was the depositors session. In answer to a question, she said, well, of course, we don't own the archives. We just curate them, and then we retire and other people take them over. And this was rather salutary for me, and it made me think, well, this is why we do this sort of thing. It's to preserve the material so that future generations will also be able to see it. And again, I hope that digitization projects will have some role to play in that. I'm very grateful to the Reconciliation Fund of the Department of Foreign Affairs for supporting this event, and a previous workshop in Oxford, the future workshop in Belfast, which has brought together all of you. You know, to be vulgar for a moment, nothing happens without money. And we owe a debt to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for making sure that all of you were able to get here and had the lunch, which is actually rather better than your usual workshop or conference, I thought. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. It's been very interesting for me. The message that I've got in all of the sessions has been more collaboration, please. You want to see more of each other and learn from each other, and I hope that will become possible. So thanks all of you. And finally, thanks to Catriona for bringing many years of experience to the conversation today, and particularly for this session this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.